recording recording this without being reminded.
Excellent.
Meanwhile, in Rome, the government fell, hell froze over, and pigs have been reported to be flying.
Lovely.
Okay, well, let's get rolling here. I'm going to begin with an analysis of, well, in fact, I'm just going to jump right over to, let's see, how do I want to show my screen, and and I don't see the control for that. Wait, maybe it's here. Share screen. Yes. One participant can share at a time. Yes. And so I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Share that. Okay. Excuse me, dog. So let me begin actually by showing this. Okay, this is the usage record that I keep whenever anybody is on Le Morte d'Arthur and they make a move, they do a turn, it prints one line to a file. And so, for example, this line here, on Thursday, 17 November at 14:07 GMT, these are the screen dimensions of this user. I didn't want to violate anyone's privacy, but I needed to be able to differentiate users. I forget what this number is. Here's their browser information. And let's see, I can't remember exactly what that number is either. But these two numbers here are the turn. This is turn 6, and the player chose option number 1. And these are some of the global variables that that user has accumulated. So this allows me to this complete record from Thursday the 17th through Friday, actually partly into Saturday, yesterday. And so this gives me an idea of what's going on. It turns out I really should have gotten more information about people, but I've spent a lot of time looking at this data, and let me show you some of the results. Let's see, here's how much time people spent with it. And I have this lap dog, by the way, who's grown a little bit. Let's see, here are, so you can see that most people, this is the amount of time a player spent taking turns, doing things on it. And you can see the vast majority of people spent, less than 5 minutes playing with it. And in fact, most of those with more than 10 minutes all come from one person. So there's a great deal of just dipping the toe in the water. Next is an indication, come on, of how far people got into it. Let's move that over. That is how far. This is the end of game. One person reached the end of game twice. Everybody else only got, except for this one here. In fact, this was this was another person, but most people just only went about 10 or 20 moves in and then walked away. So again, we have people just barely dipping their toes into the water. Let's see what this one says. Oh, that's not yet. So I will drop out of screen sharing now. stop share. There it is. Okay. So what does this mean? And I examined a number of other factors. Basically, nobody's really playing the game except one or two people. Now, this is as of November 17th. I know that there was a lot more activity earlier, but I think the conclusion we can draw from this is that Le Morte d'Arthur has very little appeal. People just aren't that interested, find it uninteresting, and walk away from it. Did you want to say something, Craig?
Well, one thing that I've noticed for myself is that I haven't actually shared it with anyone at this point. So is it available to be shared with other folks?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Right now, I'm looking, I'd say only about 100 people in total know of the existence of Le Morte d'Arthur. And I suspect that a great many of them have had a look at it. But it's also true that most of those people have a look at it and walk away. So the conclusion here is obviously Le Morte d'Arthur doesn't have that much appeal. So, what does all of this mean? Well, I think a great deal of this, of the significance here has to do with the nature of the audience. And that's why I want to once again share the screen. Now here this is something I concocted that very roughly, that represents my guesses. Here, let's move that over. My guesses as to the tastes or interests of people at various ages. And so young people, they want to see action. They love video. They hate text. They're not interested in interpersonal relationships. They enjoy puzzles and spatial type stuff. And above all, they got to win or be able to win. And if we look at the other extreme down here, we've got the old fogies who are really not at all interested in action or video, but they're very happy reading text, and they are especially interested in interpersonal relationships. And then the standard challenges of most games have no appeal to these old fogies. And then in general, there are people in between with in-between levels of interest. Now, these are all wild guesses, and I'm sure we can argue over the values I have placed on them, but I think it's fairly easy to say that these are in the right general ballpark. And I think this reveals the nature of the problem. Almost all of our people who've seen Le Morte d'Arthur are in the 20 to 40 year age bracket. And so Le Morte d'Arthur has nothing in the way of action, nothing in the way of video, well, almost nothing, lots and lots of text, some serious interpersonal relationships, no puzzles, no spatial stuff, and really it isn't at all about winning or losing. And so this really just expresses rather qualitatively the discrepancy between what Le Morte d'Arthur has to offer and what the current audience enjoys. So at the same time, however, it does suggest that the old fogies will very much like it. Problem, how do I reach the old fogies? Well, that's another matter entirely, which I'll get to a bit later. Now, a quick and easy, cheap answer to this would be to say, well, All I need is a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign and I can reach those people, but I don't have multi-millions of dollars. So instead, I'd like to talk about audience engineering, because most people, especially entertainers, think of the audience as a fixed entity, and they just have to figure out what that audience wants, and from there figure out how to satisfy that requirement. But in fact, audiences are always changing. Let me get rid of that there. Audiences are always changing, and in fact, artists are changing the audience. For example, if we talk about the evolution of Western music, now it's extremely complex, but here is a very simple observation about changes in Western music. Bach came along, and of course, he came before there were serious audiences for music, but later critics, he did have a big impact on Western music, but later critics complained that his music had a sort of a mathematical style to it. It was overly formal, didn't have lots of feeling to it. But, well, then Mozart came along a few decades later, and his music had lots of feeling, very emotional, but it was actually more joyous, pleasant, light, fun. It was a very different style. You could dance to it. You certainly couldn't dance to anything by Bach. But Mozart very much changed the perception of what music should be. And music is fun. But then Beethoven came along a few decades later, and his stuff, one early critic said that Beethoven's music was all bombastic, heavy, sledgehammers pounding down. Very much a very different style. It was about fate and death and all sorts of serious things, and again, that changed the nature of music. And then came the Romantic period, and music changed again. Audience expectations kept changing, but the changes were driven by the artists, not by the audiences. So here's another example. I've broken this up in a number of ways. The painting. Right up until about 1850, the emphasis in painting was on photorealism. I mean, a painting had to correctly depict something, but the artist's role was to create an image that had all sorts of wonderful symbolism in it. And David, a French painter, very much reflected that. I mean, this looks, well, it's definitely photorealistic, except it's not a real scene. And he's packed all sorts of symbolism into it about the great Napoleon. So that was the style, that was the expectation. And then along came Renoir in the 1850s, and he did. In fact, this was the painting that started it. His interest was completely different. He felt that a painting should reflect the impression that it made upon the eye. It should focus on the nature of the light, and it should emphasize what was special about the light. This led to a school called Impressionism. Now, at the time, this was rejected as garbage. People looked at this and their primary reaction was, this guy is incompetent. He doesn't know how to paint. And his work was just flat rejected at one time. I mean, he couldn't get any business. At one time he didn't even have enough money to buy paint. However, other artists flocked to the banner of Impressionism. Monet was one, and they did more like this, and they taught the audience that painting could do a lot more than just be a photograph, and that it could express ideas in ways they'd never expected. And the audience ended up embracing that. It took them several decades, but they learned it. Then came Picasso and Cubism, and things got really weird at this point. But and most of the audience was left behind at this point. That is, there are very few people who look at this painting and say, wow, that's really impressive. You've got to be a very educated person in terms of art, in terms of painting, in order to appreciate the qualities of this painting. But again, Picasso and the other Cubists, they changed what was expected in good painting. So, but that was just painting. Then we had video. Now, this is a shot from the Twilight Zone, famous episode with William Shatner, and he's in an airplane and he sees this weird person or monster on the wing of the airplane attacking the engines, and he can never, whenever he calls someone else to look, they don't see anything. And so it's an interesting, it's sort of a fun show. Actually, they did a remake of that episode in the 80s, which was much better. But anyway, the important thing about Twilight Zone and all the television of the 50s and 60s were that scenes were long, or the shots were long. The camera would take 20, 30 seconds, a minute in one shot. And you went from shot to shot very slowly because people's eyes needed time to adjust and take in the image and so forth. But then in 1981, I believe it was, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas changed the world with this scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, right at the beginning. Famous scene. Indiana Jones has been going through the jungle with two of his helpers, but one of his helpers, it turns out, is a traitor. And Indiana Jones is standing by a creek looking at his map, and the traitor decides it's time to make his move. And so he pulls out his gun and clicks or cocks at the trigger, making a clicking sound. Indiana Jones whirls around, grabbing his whip, raises the whip, throws the whip down. Look at the helper here going, oh, ouch. And in this shot, you can see the whole scene, and it hits the bad guy who says, ouch, and drops his gun, and the gun falls into the creek, and the guy runs away. What's important about all of these shots is this all took place in 3.5 seconds. Some of those shots are only half a second long. And in fact, I encourage you to go back and watch this scene on YouTube, and you will not see many of the shots. You'll see this one and this one, but you will probably miss that one and or this one. This one is the hardest to see. But the thing is, audiences still understood what happened. My parents would look at this and say, what's going on here? It's just a blur of images. But we have no problem interpreting this. That's because this was me and my generation in the 1950s. We watched television. lots and lots of television. And so we were video literate, which meant that we could understand scenes like that one from Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so just the existence of lots of video engineered the audience to be more literate and to be able to understand more highly compressed imagery. So that's another example of audience engineering. Let's see where I'm going from here. My parents, though, their experience with video was confined to, here, oh, that doesn't want to do it, was confined to Our Gang, or also known as the Little Rascals. Have any of you ever seen any of these movies? These were, they were our generation. We saw this stuff on TV all the time. And I still remember the they'd go running off and doing all sorts of silly things. This is one of the early groupings. They kept changing their actors as the kids grew up. I don't see Darla in this one. She was the
or Spanky or Alfalfa or
yeah. They're I think the fat guy on the left is the early Spanky. But this may be a later group, but I'm pretty sure this is an early group. So yeah, this is not the classic Our Gang group. But anyway, this is what my parents were raised on. And they had Saturday theater things where you'd go to the theater and you'd pay like 10 cents and you'd be in there all morning, and they'd show some cartoons and some Our Gang and maybe a Western. And it was a standard thing. In fact, I went, that practice continued. I went to a couple of those in the 50s. Did you ever go to any of those, Craig?
No, I happened to see those on syndicated television, like all proper folks in the 70s.
Yeah, yeah. Those were that Saturday morning movie thing was dying out in the 50s. Television was killing it. So anyway, but the only video my parents saw in the 30s were these movie things once a week for a few hours, whereas my generation was brought up on television every day after school and well into the evening. So we're much more video literate. Okay, that concludes. No, wait, I do have one more image here. So let me stop screen sharing here. So audiences do change. And the question here is can we see the audience changing, the audience for interactive storytelling changing? Certainly we know we have two audiences already existing. The main one is the gamer audience, which is gigantic, but very much set in its ways. And I mean, the idea of a game in that community is very firmly fixed, and any violation of its standards will earn only contempt. But the second group is much smaller. It's the interactive fiction group. And again, that's also like 50 years old, 40 years old. And it's also very, it's set in concrete as well. So golly gee, what can we rely on, or what can guide us in figuring this out? And once again, I'm going to share the screen, go back to screen sharing, and show you this image. Okay, it turns out that technology has given us some good examples of markets, not necessarily audiences, a little bit, markets that have been created out of nothing. The first of these was video games. There's absolutely no precursor to video games played at home, and yet that became a huge industry. The trick was that a lot of money was poured into marketing it, and that was one of the reasons. In fact, a crucial point in the history of video games. There had been, I believe, Fairchild was the first company to release a home video games machine, but it only had a couple of games and it wasn't very good, and so it really didn't catch on. And then somebody else did one. Was it
You had the Magnavox Odyssey was the first one.
Yeah.
That was the first in-home one that had the cartridges, but they were more jumpers than anything. Fairchild was the one that had the actual cartridges in it.
Yeah. Shush. So, and then Atari came out, and Atari had its 2600 and it was selling it, and it was doing about as poorly as everybody else was. These things just weren't catching on, largely because they couldn't afford to make real quality games because they didn't have a big enough market. Well, the crucial point came when Nolan Bushnell sold Atari to Warner. And in, I believe it was 78 or something, he reached a point where he decided that the 2600 just wasn't succeeding, and it was time to abandon it and move up market to personal computers. And Warner, the guy's name at Warner was Manny Gerard, I believe, and he overruled Nolan Bushnell and said, no, we just need to stick with it, build the market, and spend more money on marketing. And Bushnell ended up leaving Atari over this fight. And in 79, Christmas of 79, the market for the 2600 exploded. And boy, Nolan Bushnell was really, really wrong. And Atari started making obscene amounts of money. So it was just a matter of marketing, but it cost millions of dollars.
Hey, Chris, quick question. Which
Yeah.
years were you working at Atari for my historical notes here?
I joined Atari just after Labor Day in 1979.
Oh, cool. So kind of on the precipice of this inflection.
Yep.
Nice.
In fact, Christmas of 79, they decided to give a bonus to all of the games programmers, and I just barely made the cut for getting a bonus. So
nice. You weren't there when Chubbs and Wozniak were there, you just missed them?
Actually, they were there a bit earlier. I believe only Jobs was there. No, Wozniak was there too. But that was they left a couple of years earlier. I joined just as the four guys who formed Activision were leaving. So I believe I met them all, but they were gone like the next week. So anyway.
And when did you leave? 84?
I was laid off in March of 84, along with thousands.
After the crash?
Yep, after the crash.
Okay, wow, that's wild. Oh, man. Yeah. Was that tough for you?
Actually, no, not at all. In fact, the timing was almost perfect. First, Warner had a very generous severance package. I got nearly a year's income in severance. And so that meant I could spend a year making the transition. And I actually did get a very nice offer from Amiga, but I had decided that the Macintosh was the wave of the future. And so I spent $10,000, $1984 to buy
Yeah.
Lisa, which was the development system for the Mac at the time. You couldn't write software on the Mac.
Right. You needed it. Yeah.
So I got the Lisa. God, that thing was bad. It had a 5 megabyte hard drive, and it would take 10 minutes to compile a program. Those were the bad old days.
You know that compiling is coming back in style because all the JavaScript and TypeScript, which is just JavaScript, you add back in the static typing for your own sanity's sake instead of declaring it a 0 or empty parentheses as a mental note. It's just another way of making a mental note. And now it compiles to what's called WebAssembly or WASM. And then it executes in the browser as a compiled bunch of code. That's where things are going now.
There's any need for that because the machines are so ridiculously fast. I mean, we used to count cycles. Literally, I'm not kidding. With the Atari, with the 2600, you had 76. You had to write your code to execute. The system displayed one scan line at a time. That was all the graphics was capable of doing. So what you did was you loaded the commands for that scan line into the chip. And then while it was displaying it, you prepared the next scan line. You had 76 machine cycles to prepare the next scan line and get it in before that next scan line started. And this was really, really tight. You had to be very good to get everything to fit. Just getting anything to display on the 2600 was quite a challenge, and very common.
You're working in assembly.
Oh yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Wow.
With a 6507 processor that only had 128 bytes of addressable memory on it.
Yep.
Amazing.
And it was a very common experience in those days. You'd be in your office, and then way down the hall, you'd hear the cry, 78! And somebody needs to cut 2 cycles out of their code. And this was really difficult stuff. So anyway, nowadays, though, I mean, I used to really sweat processing time, but that was with a processor that was running at 1 megahertz. Nowadays, we're running at 3 gigahertz, 3,000 times faster.
I think that you should continue the presentation, but you should definitely write an essay or a little series of essays or something. Maybe essay is not the right word. Just little storytelling, recounting your time in Atari and some of the ins and outs, because I think a lot of people would definitely be curious about that, and that we need to get that recorded on the internet, because that's like the video game company, and that information will get lost to history if we don't document it. So,
well, an academic, I can't remember who it was, wrote an entire book on that called Chasing the Beam.
Racing the Beam.
Racing,
right.
Yes,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And
yeah, but from Chris Crawford's POV, it's like a very interesting guide into. I haven't read that. I should.
If you can find it, Chris, if I may tell you about your bibliography, if you can find it, Chris Crawford on game design has got a whole bunch of anecdotes like that in there.
Yeah.
That's true.
Which is sadly out of print.
read it
Yeah.
many years ago. Cool. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, here I'll show you what it was like. This is where I wrote some of my early code. This is a piece of papyrus. And I mean, we were using really primitive tools back then.
Nice.
Anyway, so let's see. Next audience that was created was personal computers. This actually wasn't as difficult. There were two basic threads that created that marketplace. The first was the computer aficionados, such as myself. In fact, let me bring something over here. We beginners, or back in the good old days. Let me see if I can do this. Here we go. Yeah, you can see it just right. Back in the good old days, this is upside down. But if you wanted a personal computer, you had to make one. And so I made mine based on the Kim 1 processor. Here's what it looks like inside. You can see back in those days, things were a little wild and crazy. You know, you really had to, let's see if I can tilt that a little more. It was hard stuff back then, but there were people like me who were real aficionados because we liked the idea of having our own computer. And so, chew the bone, not the computer. And so we built them, and we popularized them, and as a result, we that thread of enthusiasts that primarily supported the Apple II. That was the Apple II benefited from that group of people, even though I never got an Apple II. But the other group were the games. Really, the big boom in personal computers came from people playing games. This was much to the shock of the Atari marketing people, who tried to sell, in the early days, the things they tried to sell computers with were, one, educational software, and the stuff Atari was selling was real crap. It was bad. And the other one they always talked about was kitchen recipes for the wife, so that she could, you know, you could decide exactly, you know, 3.9 eggs, exactly how much stuff goes in for a given number of meals. But what really sold the Atari was Star Raiders. In fact, Star Raiders all by itself created Atari. If Star Raiders had not been built, Atari would have disappeared. So anyway, that's what sold personal computers. Then there were there were like spreadsheets, which were crucial to business, and which Apple got the start on with VisiCalc. And that was a major factor in Apple making the transition from a hobbyist machine to a business machine. Word processing really didn't get started until the Mac came along, but word processing was also something that had to be created out of thin air. There was no market or audience for word processing, but people learned about its benefits, and since they already had a computer, they started doing it. Email is another example of a market that appeared out of nowhere. It was initially done by academics using the early internet. But once email became accessible to consumers, which really didn't gain momentum until late 80s, early 90s, then we got the network effects kicking in. That is, I have an email account, I've been using it, and somebody wants to, you know, calls me on the phone and says, I need to talk to you about blah, blah, blah. And I just say, hey, send me an email. And they say, what's that? And a few days later, we have a new person on the email system. And once there were enough people using email, it just mushroomed. And then, of course, the web, which also was created out of thin air. That is, the audience for it was. And again, in the early days, it really wasn't that useful because we were all coming in at 300 baud. And so really the web was just text. And it took a while before things speeded up enough that you could actually have an image. Another example of a market created out of nothing was mobile phones. But their benefits were fairly obvious. Everybody had long been using fixed line phones, but the benefits of a mobile phone were obvious. And so that market really didn't have much difficulty coming along. Let's see, Steve Jobs invented both the iPod, or pushed the iPod and the iPhone. And both of those were markets that were created out of nothing. They were largely supported by our Apple marketing, but again, they took off and did beautifully. And so this is another example of a market coming out of nowhere. So let me stop sharing. We go back to standard. So yes, markets can be created out of nothing. And so it is theoretically possible that we can create a market for interactive storytelling. I think we can conclude that that market will not come out of the games audience, that in fact, it will not come out of any existing audience. And so it will have to, we'll just have to build it up slowly. There is a possibility, if somebody can produce a good soap opera interactive story world, it might be possible to piggyback that onto the existing very large market for soap operas and Gothic romance novels. So that's a possibility.
Yeah, romance is unintuitively so much bigger than sci-fi and fantasy in the fiction world.
Yeah.
And it's because it's basically porn for women. It's like,
yeah.
Well, what if this guy was like kind of bad, but then he was like good to you, and you know, they love it. And I'm not the one to write that, but I've thought about it, and yeah, it's a way to make money as a writer. It's one of the only really reliable ways. So I think that's a great point. However, I do think you're incorrect about some of the constituent statements, because the games audience is much more diverse by now than the one that you're familiar with, which are these testy guys who go on and leave the comments, you know, or the guys that you would be at loggerheads at GDC when you came and kind of like insulted everybody rhetorically. And then the people were like incensed by that. That was such a class. I mean, in some ways that's not great because you could have been diplomatic, but in other ways it's legendary because it's like Ricky Gervais doing the Golden Globes and making fun of Leo and everybody else. You know, he's like, I'm never going to do this again, so I might as well go for the gold. So like, okay, so the casual games audience in the 2000s with broadband, the distribution, the digital, and it's these kind of fun, you know, pick the color matched rows of vegetables, and there's anthropomorphic plant people like Plantasia. That was a good one. And you know, so I made a game like that back then, and I reached out to some like middle-aged women on MySpace. I was using a spam bot back when you could like get away with that. Those are the early days. And I was able to get some decent numbers that way. And then a couple of years later, I was kept alive by the, you know, decadence. I didn't make a great salary, but as a consultant, I did okay. I was billing like $35 an hour or 40, doing spreadsheets so that we could do these free games and you get the referrals and it goes viral. And that really actually caught fire, and the feedback loop was strong enough. And then they kind of ran out of suckers. And then it became, well, it's got to be something that's actually got some game meat to it, like Candy Crush. So people became addicted to Candy Crush, plus that McDonald's secret sauce of like buy the virtual goods, get you on the carrot. And then on the other hand, I've observed that so I think there may be some overlap from that audience, because that's oftentimes the kind of people who also buy romance novels or like soap operas. And then there's this storytelling game like subgenre, right? And like Chris has been working in that. and Chris Conley, and so there's the interactive fiction, the hypertext from yesteryear decade, and now we have these somewhat more constrained games, and Chris Conley can comment more on how big that audience is and how monetizable that content is, because like, I mean, truly your problem is our problem too, because like if we want to make money in some marginal way, even putting out these story worlds and maybe like short sprints of a few months, or we can do different things, I mean, it'd be great, right? Even if the income isn't so big, if I could work on something with marginal input costs, just my labor for some months, and then get $5,000 or $10,000 out of it over a year and a half or 2 years, that would be pretty good. It doesn't have to be like a big business. And then I can just make a new story world every 4 months. It sounds pretty great, right? So I think that audience exists. One of maybe the better examples would be Paradox resurgence of Vampire under V5 with the video game. So Bloodlines got delayed because Chris Avallone, who's the guy who wrote Planescape Torment, he had some allegations of like he made out with a woman at a conference, and you shouldn't do that. And I'm usually on the believe women side of things. This time it seemed like, I don't know, but whatever. So I'm not like throwing Chris Avallone out with the bathwater, but Paradox sure did. And a big reason why is, and they scrubbed the writing from the Bloodlines 2 script. So Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines was a first person shooter thing, but with a lot of dialogue trees. So it was kind of almost as good as like Baldur's Gate or something like that, as far as the vibes. And you're in Los Angeles and you're a vampire and you're doing vampire things and you have vampire powers, but there's a lot of talking involved in that RPG in general, more than D&D, right? So it lends itself out of that. And it was a fan favorite. So anyway, Bloodlines 2 is going to sell a lot of dollars, you know, like they're going to probably sell 6 or 7 figure units, and it's Paradox. And so there's going to be gamer money there. But the reason why they scrubbed Chris Avallone from it, even though he probably had some pretty good little bits of content in the game, it's like, what is it, radioactive with like sexual harassment energy or whatever, but it's because of the public perception from an audience that is very like LGBT and non-gender binary, a lot of them, and like Zoomer people who are into, and a lot of women, like women and queer people, they got into the scene through this kind of like wear leather and like cool makeup and tattoos, fake tattoos or whatever, and role play vampire type thing. I'm not saying it's just Vampire, but Vampire did like move that the needle in the 90s. You had like live action role playing. So imagine like going to a tabletop game session, you can actually meet women. Like that was completely innovative, you know? And so my point is they have a couple of storytelling games that have graphics and are sort of, it's going to be a sort of a different graph flow from what you're doing or from Sweepweave. Maybe it's closer to the engine that Chris Conley was working in. I haven't played them yet. I did play a little bit of one of the werewolf ones, and yeah, like it's my confession is that it's for like I want to like these games more, you know, and figuring out ways to do an early introduction of game mechanics with clear feedback. So you go, oh, this is a game about talking to your wife and not pissing her off, which would be the example in Arthur that you have early on, right? I think stuff like that might help as well as production value. That's my
Okay.
But I don't know how well those games have sold. I'll try to look into that and report on that for y'all.
Yeah, I guess talking about like romance and text games, I think that one of the largest sort of like as far as text games go in the mobile space, like the romance stories seem to do like really well. Like they have really simple graphics, just like barely animated, and like as far as gameplay goes, they're really simplistic. Like they just have maybe a few choices per chapter, and sometimes they even hide some of the best choices behind like a currency that you need to spend real money on or something. But things like the yeah, what's it called? Yeah, like the Choices series, the things like they sell, I think, really well. I guess they're kind of like adjacent to the choice of games, like there's some overlap there. But they, I don't know, I guess like they probably attract people with their graphics, and then I'm sure there has to be a audience of people who played those and enjoyed them, but they wish that there was more meat in the interactivity. Like people have kind of like graduated from those, or they couldn't find something that was more of a weighty sort of story interaction to those.
Well,
Do
my
you have any
plan
idea
for-
about numbers? Sorry.
Not for them. Like as far as the choice of games go, I mean, they can easily sell thousands or tens of thousands if it's really successful.
Do you want to comment a little bit on your own numbers, if you don't mind?
Let me see. Look at my most recent statements. And hold on, I'm just downloading these things.
Can I do a quick interjection while you're looking at those numbers?
Please.
Yeah.
Okay. One community that might be served by this is fan fiction in some ways. There's a whole large community of folks that are busily writing stories about their favorite characters and whatnot. And that to me seems like they may be a way to wedge in, because you got a lot of very motivated people who have a lot of time, who might be willing to learn about a new system of how to approach all of this stuff. And one of the things, this reminds me, unfortunately I can't share it, unfortunately. Let me see if I can find a link to it back. Anyways, this wonderful advertisement a long ago where it was, would you shell out $1,000 to match wits with this? And it had this very blocky looking monster that was looking like such. And the answer was, you probably wouldn't. But if you had something that was a little more meaty, you would probably shell out $1,000 to match wits with whatever it was that you were dealing with. And that advertisement stuck with me more than any other, because it was one of those things of like, as a kid, I'm like, no, I would totally shell out $1,000 to match wits with whatever the hell this was. But then it was like, no, there's actually a better way of going about all of this stuff. And I think showing folks and demonstrating to them that there is a little bit more than the Inform engine or the Twine engines out there of, hey, you know, not only can you do choose your own adventure, trademark Choose Co. Type of adventure, but you can also add a little bit more personality into this stuff. And I think that is the killer piece of this. And I don't know exactly how you would get folks to understand that this is the killer part of this. And this is how you can get your own personality to shine through in this, where your writing may not necessarily carry you that whole way through.
Yeah, I guess about numbers, my first game, which was released through hosted games, which is kind of the minor secondary label of choice of games, sold several hundred, maybe 1,000 units, and that was released in 2016. And then my recent one under choice of games proper, like 9.5 months ago, so far it's sold a few thousand units, and that's apparently like low as far as choice of games goes.
And what's the price point, and how much out of, what's the net for you out of that?
I think, let me see. Yeah, it looks like it's $8. And yeah, I mean, like the contract that Choice of Games has, like you can see it on their website, they give you a quarter of their revenue after the Steam or iStore or Android store takes their cut, which is, I think they take like 30% off the top.
So do you mean to say that you're seeing about $1.50 or $2 out of the 8?
Yeah.
Oh, that's bad. You gotta, that's,
I mean, like from what authors say who like people have written, like published novels or textbooks or things, like 25% is at the high end as far as publication and writing goes.
sure. Well, like if you sold an NFT for the sake of argument, and let's say it wasn't like a scarcity collector's thing. Let's say it was just an infinite mint and it's just how you sell licenses. It's like a really simple NFT, you know? And then it like reads the signature from that, goes, okay, you unlock the game. For example, it's like digital, it's like crypto DRM. And you just would, pay some fees and you would get like 95 cents on the dollar or something. Maybe 98 even. Yeah.
I guess, Chris, you probably have the most published books of us here. Like, is that a typical publication, like 25% or less?
Well, yeah, it depends critically on the what you're selling. I've published, printed books,
Yeah, that's all.
and for that, the royalty is typically about 10%, because their costs, they have move things around in trucks and they've got to have printers running and so forth. And so that's lower. Let's see. In fact, 10% is sort of a standard for the stuff I did, because again, all the software I sold eventually was turned into a physical product that had to have trucks running it around and machines manufacturing stuff. Royalties have gone up now that distribution is electronic. You save an enormous amount of money, so they can give a higher royalty. And moreover, markets have expanded dramatically because you don't need to rely on whoever happens to walk past the shelves in Walmart that have the product. So things are a lot better nowadays than they were 30 years ago, but different world.
So just a quick interjection, GOG pays out 50% of after tax. So there's like a VAT or something. Epic Game Store takes 12%. So that's the most competitive in the industry. When I was doing casual games, unfortunately I didn't get the publication because I didn't manage my developer properly, but that was like 2008. But yeah, I was going to reheat that. Yeah, anyway. But yeah, it was something like sometimes it was bad. It was like 60% or 70 maybe that they would take, depended on the portal. Some of them were like 30%. And then of course iTunes Store solidified it at 30. But I would like to emphasize, so I mean, that's kind of up to you guys. I think Chris Conley, you should put your titles on GOG as well. Maybe I'll open up a little additional revenue. And of course they'll fire sale your games and try to just get any incremental cash flow that will go on sale, marked down from $5 to like $1.50 or something. And then I'm a buyer usually on those.
Like, that's the thing for me, like I'm not doing this full time. Like I have a day job basically.
Yeah.
Like if I was going to go the like independent publisher route, then I would need to do all of the marketing and building up my own like audience and everything. Like that's the benefit of using Choice of Games, that they handle all of that and they have a big pre-installed audience. That's a large part of what you're tapping into publishing through them.
That's interesting. And look, your sales are actually pretty good. I mean, like we're talking about thousands of dollars. That's like a payback for time invested. And I think that's pretty good.
Yeah,
So
and
I was actually encouraged to hear that.
royalties up front, which are advances against sales.
Oh, they've
Well-
Choice of Games pays advances. So that's pretty cool. Well, maybe if I'm really hard up for cash, I'll be hitting them up for that. Yeah, I was planning on just doing NFTs and I making it freely available for everyone, but you get some you unlock some director's cut content relevant to the scene. So my thing is like I've been taking an interesting pre-production journey with this Neo Monkey game. Super Chimpanzee Neo Monkey is what I'm calling it. And it's just a total like Rick and Morty, like just like half-baked, like improv kind of vibe with sci-fi. And I'm going for the Beethoven bombastic vibe in some level. And it kind of started just from mid-journeying around. And then I got a song by Carpenter Brute that I'm like, oh, this is like theme song. So I'm putting together a trailer for it. And I've arrayed 140 images in a sort of a storyboard. And I need to like double or triple that up this month. And then I've got this, I got Build Again. I meant to cancel, but I got Build Again for the novel AI. So I'm going to use that to kind of generate a lot of text that can be the bones of my text content. And then from that corpus so I'm coming at it a little bit like Wagnerian, like theatrical spectacle focus. It's kind of the opposite of like Chris Crawford's approach of like being extremely like meditative about it, and I'm gonna see if I can get some money off of the bros, because like NFTs are all burnt out, but if it's like that kind of $5 to $12 kind of price range, I feel like for an NFT you can charge more for it as well because people can resell it. It's like, so yeah, I don't know. I'll see how successful that is. And then I'd love to just do a lot of these because I lost my I had a sort of a job with running a little hedge fund, and then half of the money got lost on FTX this month, the month of November, sadly. So we're talking about like $500,000 my client lost. Ugh, brutal. We didn't withdraw on time. So yeah, we got stuck in that, lost that gig. And I'm trying to push my project out that I've been doing for 5 years in DeFi. That's my main focus of money, but I've been doing this and I hope to get some money out of it, just to like eat.
Okay. We're
So
running
that's
out of
cool.
time here, so I will just give a quick summary of what I intend to be doing with the Mortar Tour. That is, right now I'm in a quiet period where I'm just analyzing the information I'm getting about it. I'm waiting for some feedback from a reviewer and making a list of some changes I want to make. I will also begin, the next marketing step will be to inform some press people. I'll see if I can get some press people to look at it. And I'm planning on making a, complete public announcement, tell the world about it on January 1st. And then we will see what happens. I do not expect it to be a big splash. I do not expect lots of people to be playing it or my server to be overloaded or anything like that. What I'm expecting is that it will simply stay there and there will be more and more. It will build a reputation, and after a few decades, it I think will have established itself. But so I'm thinking very much in the long term. And
Is there anything we can do in the short term to help you out with this?
Yeah.
well, when I go public on January 1st, I'll be asking you guys to tell your friends. But
So not this month,
I'm sorry.
not this month yet.
No, it's I'm gonna wait until January 1 and then throw the gates open, and we'll see what happens then. I do expect to see lots of people do the dip their toes in the water thing. But the real thing I'm interested in is seeing how many people go all the way to the end. And
I'd like to volunteer. I know I've spoken about this, but now it's like I'm going to get into a sprint producing hundreds and hundreds of images for my own thing. And I would like to volunteer because I can do an unlimited amount in relaxed mode. And I just have to kind of juggle it and check in more sporadically. Instead of giving you an image in 1 minute, it'll take however long. It depends on the queue. And actually lose money on that, but it's you know, they're making money on a net basis from people who don't use it too much. So yeah, I can basically make you tons of images. I need to give it a replay. Instead of giving you tons of notes on everything, I could just take your text from each encounter, see what that does, play with some modifiers like, do we want an Ivan Earl? Do we want a realist look? And you can give me some feedback. I can just email you back and forth, and I can give you a folder full of images. And then I believe if you installed something like Crazy Egg and you were tracking the mouse movements in these sessions, because right now you're looking at histograms of like each n encounters of depth, you know, what's the cohort that dropped out after n encounters, right? That's what you were showing earlier.
yeah.
But you can look inside the encounter and see where they're kind of fizzling out. So, I mean, on one hand, I don't think you should be embarrassed about having written a lot of content and having a very immersive, it's like, I compared it to The Sopranos last time, and we just finished it. And I really stand by that, actually. Because you are sort of, it's like a true anti-hero morality. It's not a clear good and evil. And there is some kind of, you can be better than Tony was, you know, as far as how you treat your people. And that's kind of what it's really about. And so I think it's good that you immerse people. However, I do believe if you added pics and cut the word count some percentage, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. So on a net basis, you're gaining descriptive value, right? For less processing on the user. I think you'll get that curve will look less slopey, and it'll kind of, you'll get like more of a linear drop off per encounter. And that means your net percentage conversion rate from beginning to end will go up, which is what we want to accomplish, right?
My dog is telling me he really has to pee. So I need to
Okay.
cut this off.
Well, I hope you'll accept my support as I email you stuff.
I'll send you an email. So-
Okay. Great. Yeah. Once I'll go play through it and generate some stuff and give you a sampling to start to comment on.
Okay, very good. See
Okay.
you guys next month.
Happy trails.
All right,
Thank
bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.